So, I mean, one thing when I stepped out of pastoral ministry and came to work here, I mean, there's a lot of things we could talk about there, but a lot of reflection goes on about the church and what you did and where your priorities were. What are some of those reflections for you?
Yeah, that's a good question, Graeme. Yeah.
That is a very good question. I think I've realized that the most important part of church is people. And sometimes you get caught up in the processes and the politics and the trying to make things work and, you know, numbers and in actual fact, the only thing that matters in church, not the only thing, but the most important thing is the people.
Yeah.
So if I was to go back into ministry, it would be very people focused.
Yeah.
You know, it's the one thing AI can't replace.
Yeah.
Is the personal interactions that, you know, that very human side of things. Like, yeah, I think we're missing. I think that is so important.
Kia ora koutou, welcome to Lunch on the Way. I'm Joey, joined by Graeme and Louise. We are in a moment in time where we don't know what's going to happen right now. We're just going to have a wonderful conversation.
Well, in more ways than one, too.
Well, I don't know. Well, exactly. In more ways than one. What do you mean, Graeme?
Well, you know, the world we live in. We don't know what's gonna happen. So it's like, you know, it's just well, so how wide do you want to make that? You know?
No, maybe we'll keep it a bit closer.
Yeah, right.
Okay,
Yeah.
Maybe not the whole world.
Yeah.
But we have Louise today. Hello, Louise.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah.
Louise is, I guess, a staff member here at Laidlaw College in the postgraduate administrative role. But you're originally from South Africa, and I think almost to the date, I don't know when you immigrated here, but it's pretty soon it'll be a year, right?
Yeah, we got you, I think, on the 9th of May. So it's almost a year.
Yeah,
Yeah,
9th of May. Yeah, and then so you live in the North Shore where all the other South Africans live as well?
Yeah, quite by accident.
Quite
We didn't
by-
plan it that way. Like, I don't know how we just all land up together.
Yeah, and so you've been here almost a year. So how about, like, this is less of an interview, if for someone listening, this is less of an interview, more of a conversation, but we need to provide some context for who you are, because usually someone else is in that seat, like a Jonathan or somebody else, and we're like, well, who's Louise? So I know a little bit about you, obviously, from just having casual conversations. I know that you're an ordained minister in the Methodist Church of South Africa. Or
You were about to say Wesleyan Methodist.
I almost
but
did.
Yeah,
well,
but
maybe
no.
that's a bit prophetic. Maybe she should be a Wesleyan, but we'll figure that out. And you have teenage kids. You obviously immigrated from South Africa. Pastored a variety of different churches over the period of time that you lived in South Africa. But that's really, other than a few other things that I don't know a whole lot. So one thing I'd love to start with is maybe give us a little bit of your background that kind of led you up into like ministry, and then that shift from here in South Africa to here, just to provide some context a little bit.
Okay. So how long do we have?
Oh, an hour. Yeah, okay, maybe like
Goes quickly, though.
let's say like 5 to 8 minutes. You don't need to go through like the whole story. It goes by quickly. It does.
Yeah, no.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode, and don't forget to
Like and subscribe on YouTube.
And if you're listening to this on audio, don't forget to follow and rate.
We really appreciate your listening.
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I suppose my journey started when I was quite young. Grew up in one of those households where my mother tried to force us to go to church all the time. My brothers, I'm the youngest of 3, and my 2 brothers used to pay me if I made us too late for church, so that we had to skip.
Well, that's clever. It's an entrepreneurial part.
Yeah,
of your
very
brother,
good.
right?
Hey, I became quite good at it. You know? So grew up not really interested in church, and then my brother became an addict when he was about 12. And so grew up in an addict family. So watched how all of that just unraveled the whole family. I was quite young then. I think I was about 8 when that happened. And so for my whole teenagehood, it was just exposed to this life of an addict family. Because when one family member is an addict, it affects the whole family. And I remember when I was about 16 or 17, my oldest brother, he came to me one day and he said, oh, I found Jesus, you know, so my whole life is going to change. And I thought,
Okay.
you have tried so many different things, like how's this going to make an impact? And then I watched his life slowly transform. And I thought there must be something to Jesus, because I've never seen anything else work like this. And so I started going to church with some friends of mine.
How old are you at this point?
I was about 15, 16 at this point.
Yeah.
Started going to church with some friends of mine, joined different youth groups, started getting involved in the church. And then the church I was in was a very old congregation. I think there were 2 teenagers in this church.
So they were excited you showed up.
They're
like,
so excited.
here come the young people now. We've been praying for decades. Here they are.
So that church kind of roped me in to do children's ministry, be part of the worship. They used to pay me to play the piano at funerals. So that's how I earned my pocket money. And then when I was 18, I'd become so involved in church, but I wanted to be an engineer. So I really enjoyed maths and science, thought I wanted to be an engineer, earn a lot of money. And then I had a strange dream. This all sounds crazy when I tell it, but this is just my story. So I had a strange dream that it was the end of the world. Take that as you may, like your interpretation of Revelation. Mine has changed over the years, but when I was that age, I had this dream that it was the end and everybody was going up to meet Jesus. And I saw him and I was going and I said to him like, oh, so glad to be here. And I looked down and I saw a whole bunch of people left behind. And I said to Jesus, what about them? And he said, but they don't know me. So I said, yeah, but you can't just leave them. And he said to me in my dream, he said, well, then why don't you do something about it? So I said, okay, I will. And I woke up and I kind of had the sense that I needed to tell people about Jesus. Like that was my just absolute sense. And so I prayed about it and I said, if this is the case, open up a door. Just give me a job, because I don't know what to do now. I'm 18 years old. What do you do when you're 18 years old? 2 weeks later, the church approached me and said, we feel that you should be our youth pastor. We can't pay you, but we think you need to be our youth pastor. So
Classic church move.
Classic church move.
Was this, what denomination was this in?
Methodist.
Oh, so it was Methodist.
Yeah.
So
It
this
was
is the one you
Methodist.
stuck with.
This is the one I stuck with.
Okay.
So I entered it, became a youth pastor, loved it. I worked with quite a lot of very poor children in South Africa. I'm in a poor community. Absolutely loved it. Was in that church for 6 years and then moved up and eventually became ordained.
Wow. So you're 18, start youth pastoring, was it? And then, or did you have the title of youth pastor? Because I know Methodist churches like quite hierarchical sometimes. So it's like, no, you're the youth director or you're the youth lay pastor, or, it's like, you're not quite there yet. You need to go through the process. So anyway, so you were the youth pastor.
Yeah.
Cool. And so what did the education journey look like then for you from 18 to when you became ordained?
So my education journey was that I studied correspondence. So I studied while working full time. Did a bachelor's degree in theology.
Yeah.
My senior pastor at the moment told me I also needed to do a BCom just in case I decided ministry wasn't for me. But I did 1 year of that and then pulled out. Didn't enjoy it
Why
as
was that?
much.
Is this you didn't like the content?
Yeah,
or?
I didn't like the content as much as I liked theology. So I did a bachelor's degree, then went on to do an honors, and then went on to do a master's.
Yeah.
And so my journey was a little bit different in the Methodist Church, because the Methodist Church now wants you to go to their seminary for 3 years in order to get a degree. I did it all correspondence.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I already had my degree when I candidated to be ordained.
I see. And then how old were you when you were ordained?
I cannot remember.
20-something.
No.
No?
Actually later.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. I think it was 2018.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
But you've been
So-
pastoring for a long time.
So
up to that
my
point.
candidature, because I didn't go to seminary,
Yeah.
my probation was very long. My probation was 7 years.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Because when I went through that process, when I graduated when I was 22 from my undergrad degree, it was only 2 more years I had to wait because it was that, I followed their track, and so I was like, oh, you must have got ordained early, but I'm like, no, you went road less traveled. Yeah.
So your husband is also a Methodist minister.
Yes.
So how does that work? Well, I mean, not work, but how? Well, how did you bump into your husband? What's?
So we were both youth pastors when we
Okay.
met,
Okay.
and we met on a youth camp,
Oh, right.
church camp.
Oh, how nice.
Yeah, his first words to me was, we were sitting like behind each other, and they said, "Oh, tell someone why you're here." And he turned around and looked at me and said, "I'm here to find a wife."
Oh, there we are. Hello.
Yeah, that's very
as his
straight.
joke. And
yeah.
I gave him what for and said, that's not why you should be on a church camp.
Oh, you gave
Who do
him
you
what
think
for?
I
you
did,
are?
yeah. And now we're married.
That's a good story.
That's a, you know, that
He
was
obviously
good.
played his cards well.
Yeah.
Yeah, apparently he planned it from the beginning.
Oh, did he?
Yeah,
Like he
'cause-
spotted you and he was like, I'm going to say this.
Yeah, because we'd
Yeah.
been in like youth pastor meetings
Yeah.
planning the camp.
Mm.
So he had actually known me for a few months.
Oh, right. So
yeah.
he baited you, really.
Yeah.
Wow.
I had no clue.
How do you feel about that now, looking back? He just-
Manipulated. I think.
Oh, that's good. Oh, those are good stories. That's a good story.
Yeah, I love that
Okay.
stuff. Okay, so you're ordained in 2018, but pastoring since you're 22. Correspondence through all the way. Yeah, so what? I know you moved around a lot as a pastor. Was it mostly in Johannesburg in South Africa? Yeah. And so, what did that look like? How many churches have you pastored at? I've only pastored at 2 over the decade I've been in ministry.
So, yeah, the Methodist Church is interesting. So, because it's quite hierarchical, they have control over where you go.
Yeah.
So when I first candidated, I had a superintendent who was supposed to sign my forms, and he signed and didn't get a witness to sign his form with him. And so the Methodist Church came and said, oh, we're not accepting your application because a witness didn't sign it. However, we have a church that's in trouble, so we're going to move your husband from your current church to a different church, and we're going to move you from where you are to pastor this church, even though you're not officially in the system. So that was the first church that I pastored. I was youth pastor, then I was a family pastor. Then they moved me to this church to pastor as like the senior pastor.
And how old are you at this point then? Still in your
24.
20, dang,
Yeah,
24
24.
and like
And-
lead
and-
solo pastor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this
Yeah.
is how what size church?
That was quite a small church, probably about 100 members maybe.
Mm.
Yeah, very old church. It was actually the church I grew up in.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
So you're
cool.
kind of familiar with
Yeah,
it.
so I was familiar
So
with it.
that makes sense.
So I was there for 2 years, and then moved to a different church in a neighboring town.
Yeah.
That was quite a large church. We had a few thousand members. We had probably on a Sunday about 1,200 people.
Yeah.
I don't know how it is here, but in South Africa you can have a large membership, but it doesn't reflect that on a Sunday.
Oh, right.
Yeah, no,
okay.
that's the opposite problem here.
Oh, really?
We have a small membership, and then usually it's larger, I think, because we have
Well, memberships really has got really wobbly over the last 30, 40 years.
It's gotten a
What do you
bad
mean?
rap a little bit here because it's like, oh, what do you mean signing me up to responsibility? Who do you think you are with being a member? And then now I think it's, as a pastor, I'm like, no, I want to know who the members are at the church who are like committed.
Yeah.
So it's different. So if you're a member at the church, it's like a higher level of commitment, at least in my denomination here.
Okay.
So we have more people who attend, would call our church home, as opposed to what actually shows up on a Sunday morning. But what shows up on a Sunday morning is actually a larger number than who would actually be a member or a partner of the church.
I mean,
Yeah.
part of that, just to deviate slightly, part of that is the social contract has changed.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a Baptist church in New Zealand would be congregational, so they'd have quarterly meetings. So a member has power in that quarterly meeting to vote. Now, Baptist doesn't reflect all the denominations,
No.
but they've slightly changed. And then also your Pentecostal ones have slightly changed as well. So that lever for congregants to be part of the picture in terms of power. So why would you become it's lost that leverage for a congregant to necessarily become a member.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because why would I?
Yeah. Exactly.
There's no, it's like, it doesn't make sense.
But now after COVID, I've noticed that like the membership or partner, we call it partnership in my denomination, partnership thing has actually grown in importance, at least for me personally, because I'm
Right.
like I actually want to know if somebody senses that they belong here and like they're going to put roots in this community, because people can be so transient.
Yeah, but
as,
then
you
that's
know?
the other part, isn't it?
You know?
New Zealand's very transient.
Yeah. Anyway, so you're pastoring, you're in your 20s, maybe you start to have a family, and then you pastor numerous churches, I imagine, over the years.
Yeah.
And then leading up to,
So I was at that church. I was an associate minister there.
Yeah.
And then I was there for a total of, I think, 12 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah,
That's
so
a
I
good
was there
chunk.
for quite a long time.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I had accepted an invitation to go and pastor a church in a place called Pretoria.
Yes, I've heard of that place.
It's the capital, isn't it?
Yeah, that's
I've
a
seen that
capital.
It's a
You're
great
right,
name for
yeah.
a place. I love the
Pretoria.
name Pretoria. It just
Pretoria.
sounds like, I don't know, Greco-Roman for some reason in my
Yeah, it
head.
does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Praetorian Guard.
Pretoria. For Pretoria. Like, I just, like, imagine that.
Sounds Latin, doesn't it?
It's a little bit. All right. This is, I
I'm
obviously
sure you
haven't-
don't think that.
I haven't been to South Africa
do it
before.
now. I
You
think
do?
it now,
All right,
yeah.
cool. All right, so you go to Pretoria.
Yeah, so I go to Pretoria. The plan was that Charlie and I would now be in the same circuit because him and I had always
Cool.
been in separate circuits.
Oh, really?
So this is like districts of the Methodist Church.
Yeah.
I always want to say Wesleyan, sorry,
Yeah,
of the
fine.
Methodist Church.
It's about the same thing.
I hope so. Yeah.
So we had always been separate. So we decided to accept an invitation to 2 neighboring churches so we'd at least be ministering in the same town. So I was there for 2 years, and then the Methodist Church, while I was there, they wanted me to stay at the large church where I was as an associate minister because they were going through transition.
Mm-hmm.
So they said that I'm not allowed to move completely across. So I was the senior pastor at this church in Pretoria
Mm-hmm.
while I was still the associate pastor at the church in Benoni.
How far away?
About 50 kilometers.
Oh, okay, that's not too bad.
It's not too bad. And in South Africa, the roads are a lot quicker than in Auckland.
Right.
Health and safety has dominated this country. Anyway, sorry. I know I can go 120 kilometers an hour, no problem in Canada,
Yeah.
but not here. Anyway.
South Africa as well. So it was about a 40-minute commute.
All right. Okay.
So I was there for 2 years doing that. And then the Methodist Church asked me to go and become the senior pastor of the church in Benoni.
Mm-hmm.
So I was the senior pastor there for about 3 years.
That's a
Okay.
very large church, was it?
Yeah, that was quite a large church. We had 4 ministers and about 30 staff. And then we had
4 ministers
4 ministers,
and 30 staff.
30 staff.
So you had a bunch of like parachurch organized, like external ministries a part of the church, or
That
how did
was-
that work?
That was
secretaries and PAs and things like that. you
So
know.
it was like youth pastors, children's pastors, worship pastors, people that ran mission for us,
Yeah.
people who did.
Mm.
And then we had 2 para organizations outside
I
of that.
see. Oh,
They
okay.
also had about 40 staff.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because the one was a preschool, which was quite a big preschool.
Yeah.
So in total, there were
Okay.
about 70 staff.
Wow.
Gosh.
And then, so you as the lead pastor, like, you're responsible for kind of the whole, in a way?
Yeah, I mean, so I like team ministry. So although I was
Yeah.
the senior pastor,
Yeah.
I made sure that each of us had responsibilities, and we kind of worked.
Yeah.
We'd meet weekly to make decisions together.
Oh, okay.
It was all about just
Mm.
Yeah.
being a team.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, if anything went wrong, it was on me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And was this during COVID or before
Yeah.
COVID? Yeah.
So it was. They asked me to take over in the October of 2019,
Okay, and then you got the,
and then COVID hit in 2020.
wow.
So
Yeah. Hello.
yeah, I was like,
And
nice.
it was bad. And it was bad in South Africa too, wasn't it?
It was very bad in South Africa
Because you didn't have the lockdowns, nor the medical.
No.
So
All the
did you-
governmental support, financial support, none of that.
Whoa. And then so you just kind of just went for it.
Yeah.
Did you have friends that died?
A lot of congregation members that died.
Oh, that's
So-
pretty tough.
Yeah, we had, I think our worst was in 2021 between the 4 ministers at our church. So we were quite a community church, so the whole community knew our church. And so I think the worst stage was when we were fully booked for funerals 3 weeks in advance, all 4 of
Oh
us.
my goodness.
So that was, yeah, we did a lot of funerals in that season.
And did you personally do a lot of funerals,
Oh,
or was
yeah.
it shared amongst everyone because it was so crazy?
All of us did a lot.
Woof.
Did that take its toll on you?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Especially watching, I think the most difficult was watching people suffer alone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like knowing that people had died without their loved ones, and then just seeing how that impacted their loved ones.
Gosh.
It was a tough time.
I don't want this to necessarily be a COVID conversation because that's 5 years ago from the start of that. However, it's crazy how different countries have radically different experiences. Like here in New Zealand during COVID, it was like we were so sheltered from it. Like I didn't know anybody who had COVID personally until probably early 2022. And so that's basically 2 years on. I didn't know anybody. And even when it was like rushing through the community in 2022 to the end of 2022, it was, like, some people are dying, but I didn't know anybody who died. I don't know anyone personally who died, or maybe they did die, but it wasn't because of COVID. It's because they just had it and it was because of something else. And then I know in the U.S. in late 2020 and early 2021, there was like that big wave of people. Everyone knew someone who was dying, it seemed like. And I'm like, oh my gosh, we really had quite a sheltered experience compared to a lot of countries. And we still complained a lot. You know, we still complained a bunch. So we didn't understand, I don't think, like the actual human toll.
We never got some of the variants that you've got. I mean, that's what Linda mentioned to me. But you know, I was up at the hospital yesterday because we do a service, and so they're building at Waitakere the new wings to the hospital, and it just comment to me. So my wife said to me, "Oh, they're building this because of COVID." I said, "Oh." Really? She said, yeah, because of the capacity wasn't enough during COVID, which really leveraged the argument for extending the hospital.
Yeah.
So I thought, oh, that was interesting.
Well, that's
so
good, yeah.
I mean, we know the hospitals were full, but we really don't know to what extent.
No.
But nothing like what other countries experienced. We were quite isolated.
So you're feeling quite burnt out at this point by the end of that season.
Yeah, I think at the end of that season, it was... Look, I mean, some of it was really good. We got to push a lot into mission.
Yeah.
So we got to partner with the government and with the army. We actually literally went to the army base and said, like, we're this church, we're willing to help you. They gave us permits, so we were able to work right through.
Nice. You got clearance.
Yeah, we did, which was quite nice.
Yeah.
So we got a lot of mission.
Yeah.
We just became a mission-focused church.
Yeah.
So that was our aim. And then, you know, technology. I mean, the technology advanced so quickly.
Yeah.
So we were able to push into spaces of ministry that we hadn't done before.
True. Yeah.
So it had its advantages. It make the best out of a crisis.
Yeah.
You know?
So when was the big decision? Like,
Yeah,
you know,
here we
you're involved in ministry. You know, these are significant church. Your husband's in pastoring as well. So life is really like a juggernaut.
Yeah.
And then there's this rupture. So what changed everything?
My family.
So
I think having teenagers or pre-teens during COVID, I don't think we understood quite what COVID did to them.
Right.
I remember just after COVID, when we could meet again, we had a confirmation camp, and we had probably about 100 teenagers on this camp. And one of my colleagues asked the question. So all of the teenagers had their heads down and they were all focused. And she said, nobody's going to know your answer. She said, but I just want to know from this group, how many of you in the last 2 years have thought of or tried to commit suicide? And everyone, except for one boy, put up their hand. And that kid did not put up his hand because he was on his phone and didn't hear the question.
Oh, my gosh.
So out of a group of 100 teenagers in that group, every single solitary one of them had thought of or tried to commit suicide over the period of COVID. Because that's their formative years. That's when they need to be social. South Africa locked the children down, that they weren't even allowed in the shops. They weren't allowed out their houses.
Just the children specifically.
So you did have lockdown.
That's crazy. Because they were like the least likely to actually have any effect from COVID. Like it was the older people needed to get locked down, not the younger people. That's crazy.
They weren't allowed in the shops. They weren't allowed for a long time. Wow. They had to just stay in their houses. So the only outlet was social media. Social media causes depression.
Oh,
yeah.
It was...
You get lost in your phone or online for hours on end. Yeah.
So then, noticed in one of my children particularly that child was not coping. A whole bunch of things happened. We just realized things weren't going okay. And then one of the psychiatrists said to me, psychologist actually, said to me, your children feel as though you've always chosen the church. And I went, well, let me change that for now.
Yeah.
You know, and that was when the whole trajectory changed. It was a decision.
Was Charlie as well? Charlie came to the same thing, or was he?
His was a little bit less. He was in a church that wasn't as demanding.
Right.
He was in a more family-orientated church.
Right.
So he was able to stay, and I made the decision that for the season I needed to focus on my children.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I took a leave of absence from the church, focused particularly on my children, subcontracted to Charlie's church and a few other churches in the area. So I just preached, led worship, did all the fun things.
You did all the stuff you loved, not the organizational
all the things
stuff.
I loved.
Yeah.
And there was a lot at home, a lot more.
Yeah.
In that season, decided I wanted to further my education.
Mm-hmm.
Looked at different options. Thought, what would I do? Also wanted to, for a long time, wanted to come to New Zealand. My brother's been here for 7 years.
Yeah.
Oh, so that's the connection.
That's the connection. Yeah. Wanted to come here. South Africa, love it to bits, but there are a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
You know, my son at the age of 12 was sleeping with what we call a panga, which is like a giant knife under his pillow because he was so scared.
Yeah.
And I was like,
What?
when I
Yeah.
described New Zealand to him, and I said, oh, they don't have burglar bars and there's no electric fences and you don't need guard dogs. And he turned around and said, there is no place like this in the world. You're lying. And so we
Wow.
thought, well, let's give them a different experience.
Yeah.
And so looked at different options and then came here to study further.
So that's huge. For any. I mean, there's a lot of South Africans here too.
Yeah.
So my in-laws are South African, but it's a huge deal. I mean, to root your stuff, come here for nothing, and start all over again.
But you've mentioned to me and some other South African families I know, they all say the same thing, which is like, well, if I didn't leave now with my kids would have left eventually anyway.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, we might as well just go together. And that seems to be the reality of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my brother said it like this. He said, either we have to take the knock or our children are going to.
Yeah.
Oh, right. And then it's
Yeah.
going to be even harder.
And that's going to be harder.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, your brother's gone to Australia now.
What?
Yeah, as my visa was approved, he got a job in Australia.
What the heck?
So I still haven't seen him.
Oh my God.
So you haven't even seen him?
No.
Is he in Canberra?
He's in, I think it's the Gold Coast.
Oh, right. Okay.
Like,
He's just had a big storm. He might come back.
He was quite excited.
you know how people...
He's not a surfer, is he? He doesn't go out in the surf, because it's 12.5
beach.
meters, 12.5 meter,
That sounds awesome.
waves. They're big waves.
But,
They're big waves.
everyone has siblings that, they do something about how old they are, and you're like, oh, yeah, I that's my brother, or that's my sister, or whatever. Like, were you surprised? Or you're like, oh, yeah, no, that makes sense.
Is he the oldest brother?
He's the middle brother.
Oh, he's the middle brother.
yeah.
And the oldest brother's still in South Africa.
Yeah, he's still in South Africa.
Yeah, wow.
Wow.
I guess, when's he coming over? Yeah.
I don't think ever.
Oh, yeah, loves it, yeah. Yeah, okay, well, that's really good to hear. And then, so, one conversation I want to have, and I'll have to hit the record button again in a minute on the camera, is all right, the one I'm trying to think of while we're having a conversation, like what would actually be something we can all kind of contribute together equally. And there's one thing that all of us have in common. Well, probably more than one, but one thing, and it's all of us have been pastors or are pastors at one point in time. All of us sensed, as you described in your story, a call to ministry, whatever that looked like at one point in time. And one thing I noticed about myself when I was on the journey from moving from Canada to New Zealand was I thought, what would it look like to not be in ministry for a period of time? And I remember even as I was beginning to just dream about, what it would look like to start a little business or something, the second I started even just like imagining it, it became incredibly uninspiring. Like I was so I liked the idea of it, but once I actually started to put ideas to action, I was like, no, I'm not called to be a business owner. I am called to be a pastor or to be in ministry in some capacity. So you describe your experience, and Graeme, I'm sure you have your own as well.
Well, I mean, I was just thinking, you are an entrepreneur, and that entrepreneurialism is something that actually is, I think, in pastoral leadership, we need entrepreneurial leaders. And in fact, the denominations, if you could, generally speaking, this is generalisation, your Pentecostals are where your entrepreneurial leaders are. Your Anglicans and your Presbyterians need entrepreneurial leaders, but the structures and everything don't attract them because they actually sort of they sort of put them through the hoops that actually takes it all out of them. So it's a tricky space because the entrepreneurialism tends to be it's not very accountable either. The sort of free movement of everything, it can be a bit wild.
The one thing I love about being a pastor, if I was ever a lead pastor, and I do sense a bit of that freedom now, is you can kind of do, within reason, whatever you want, as long as it's still within the umbrella of pastoral ministry. I know if someone's listening right now who's on a part of my servant leaders being like, you get to do whatever you want. I'm like, no, there's accountability structures, don't worry.
Yeah.
However, like if I have an idea for a different ministry or a different initiative or a different thing to do, there's like almost no resistance to doing anything you want. And so I really love that about pastoral ministry. And then there's, obviously some of the more burdensome aspects of it as well. I hate administration. Even I wouldn't even call like funerals burdensome in a way. I wouldn't call like journeying with people burdensome because there's also like a bit of a joy in it, oddly enough, because you get to be with people when they need you. and that's really significant as well, even though you didn't want to do that week or that day or whatever, whenever that tragedy happened. So that's what I really like about being a pastor, is kind of, if you have an idea, you just get to run with it and just go for it. How did you get into ministry, Grant? Like, how did you get into ministry? Was it more of like a process for you, or was it like an actual
No, I mean,
call?
because the Pentecostal thing is, you didn't go into seminary, you didn't do any of that. So I'd met Linda at a Bible college, which was sort of a 12-month sort of Pentecostal. And I don't want to belittle that, because it was a great experience and it exposed me to ministry and things like that. And I did an internship through that period in Australia, actually. So the
and
church,
then there was a storm and you came back.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Anyway, so there was a church plant, and we didn't belong to that denomination, but we felt we wanted to be missionaries in Africa, actually.
Oh, well, okay. I
And
didn't
so
know
the
that.
denomination that we're part of it, my wife was part of, and my in-laws, father-in-law and mother-in-law, were involved in this denomination, and were going to Africa. That was the plan. And so we thought, gee, that's a great opportunity. So we thought that was where we put our eggs. So we moved from Assemblies of God to Elam, and it was a church plant, and got involved there, started running the youth group grew, was most of I think 60% of the church were the youth. So it was sort of, and then like church plants run into a bit of trouble, this ran into a bit of trouble, and we fell into being the leaders of the church, and that's how I kind of fell into pastoral ministry.
So it was more. So where did that sense of call to go to Africa came from?
Oh, that was sort of growing up. I always thought that it was a missionary call.
So it was more like a growing passion inside of you.
But I felt underneath. I wasn't really. I mean, if I was really honest, it was probably pastoral call. But but the mission sounded really nice. Like, it sounded exciting. You know, like I totally. I don't know what's the word. Romantic in that sense about, I think this, I go to a missionary, I go spend 30 years on the mission field, do all this sort of stuff.
Sounds romantic until you're there.
Yeah. I had no idea really. It was as green as in everything. So that's how that happened.
Okay. And how, like 16, 17, 18, somewhere in there? That was starting to grow inside of you?
Oh yeah, it had happened earlier in my teens.
Earlier.
Because we had a lot of people come through our house that were missionaries.
Wow. And then you were 18 when you had that dream. I was 16, 17, and you said, oh, my story is a bit odd and unique. Now, Jonathan told a story about him dying and then meeting Jesus and then coming back to life and becoming a Christian. So I'm okay with weird stories. When Jonathan told us that story, I was like, all right, we're going to change the whole conversation now around that. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. But mine was not too dissimilar to yours. It wasn't a dream as much as somebody who was preaching at a service, and I was not there for most of it because I was ferrying people on and off the island of the camp. And so I just caught the end of it, and the end was just the response of, if you feel called to ministry, come to the front. And I had this voice that just was like compelled me in my head. It was like, that's you. And I'm like, all right. And then I received prayer, and then that was kind of the beginning of whatever that looked like. But that was 17, 18. So there's something about being 16, 17, 18 that kind of just...
Yeah. I would say my teenage years, because the Charismatic Renewal in New Zealand was a very big deal. So in the early 70s, my parents moved from Brethren background to Pentecostal background. So my formative years, my teenage years, were within a Pentecostal environment. And so back then it was quite holiness sort of driven, quite mission driven. And I think it was pretty formative for me. Mm-hmm. Sort of call, that kind of, the language of call was very, very prominent. God's called you. What's He called you to? So this is sort of peeling out, and you're responding to that. Yeah. So it's amazing, isn't it?
So you've been out of ministry now for about a year. How's that feel?
Withdrawal symptoms. Want to plug back in again.
Yeah, it's terrible.
It's terrible. Okay, yeah. Because this is, not only did you move country, but you've changed focus and what you've done for the past 2 decades or something.
Yeah.
And so there's probably a lot of reflecting that's happened. And so what have you learned about yourself? And I guess that sense of call, or like you're kind of at like the halfway point of like your vocational career, if you will. So what have you been thinking about the last year around that?
A few things. So very deep question.
Sorry,
So
you don't have to go as deep as the
it's
question
fine.
was.
No, so a few things is I didn't realize how much my identity as a person was attached to my ministry. So in a way, it's been good to kind of realize that there's a Louise outside of being a pastor or a minister.
Yeah.
Because I think as pastors, it's such a personal job
Yeah.
that like you become that person. So to try and discover who I am outside of ministry has been interesting. It's been quite a journey. I've realized that I don't know how long I can stay out of ministry.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I do miss so much about ministry. I miss the diversity of it. I miss the challenge of it. I miss how one day you can be, dealing with, I don't know, staffing issues, and the next you have to deal with someone who's grieving, and then you have to meet with someone who's getting married, and like, it's just so diverse.
Yeah.
I thoroughly enjoyed that. Nothing was ever boring. Really, really miss preaching.
Yeah.
That has been...
Have you preached yet since you've been here?
No.
No.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So
Not
that's
at
a while.
all.
So you can look online for. You don't know her last name, so I won't give the last name. But yeah, you can preach. Like you're a very good communicator.
I
yeah.
miss it.
So I can see why you missed that.
Yeah.
You can tell that some people just come alive when they're preaching or when they're communicating, but mostly preaching. Yeah, I could.
Is
yeah,
Charlie
I'd
in the
miss
same
that.
boat too?
Charlie is, I think he has gone into the mode of I will be the provider.
Right.
So I think he's okay where he is at the moment because he sees it as this is what needs to be done so that my family's
So it's
okay.
pragmatism. Sort
Yeah.
of
Very,
thing.
very pragmatic.
Right.
So he seems to be coping out of ministry a little bit better than me.
So, I mean, one thing when I stepped out of pastoral ministry and came to work here, I mean, there's a lot of things we could talk about there, but a lot of reflection goes on about the church and what you did and where your priorities were. What are some of those reflections for you?
Yeah, that's a good question, Graeme. Yeah.
That is a very good question. I think I've realized that the most important part of church is people. And sometimes you get caught up in the processes and the politics and the trying to make things work and, numbers and in actual fact, the only thing that matters in church, not the only thing, but the most important thing is the people.
Yeah.
So if I was to go back into ministry, it would be very people focused.
Yeah.
It's the one thing AI can't replace.
Yeah.
Is the personal
Yeah.
interactions that, that very human side of things. Like, yeah, I think we're missing. I think that is so important.
The people. So is that mostly because of a contrast of just like the organizational aspect of church that was just so prominent through, I guess, the last 10 years for you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it became very organizational heavy.
Yeah.
And I try to, I'm quite a people's person. I like people. And so I try to make it as personal as possible. But sometimes you do get a bit overwhelmed with everything else.
Yeah, that's probably been the biggest shift for me. Has been like when I started in my ministry education and formation at university, it was obviously expected that you were in ministry to care for people. That was kind of the assumption. However, I think the assumption that kind of trumped it all was the kind of tail end of the church growth and health movement, and because of that, a lot of what we are learning, and even through the chapel services and the things that we were just talking about in the dorms, were just more about the not attractional model, but more of like the functionality of ministry. Of we need to make sure they're all important. Like how to curate a proper a Sunday morning service. Well, that's important. How to be strategic in your thinking. That's important. What type of vision should you have? What's your ministry philosophy? How do you make sure that new people come into the church? Like, these are all important things, but it seemed like the functionality of that almost elevated itself above the people we were trying to serve, where it seemed like implicit in that was that the church was a machine and we wanted a particular output, which is more people, and to get more people we need to do this. And it's like an endless cycle that if not checked, or not checked by somebody who at least has some pastoral sensibilities or dispositions, can kind of just run amok. And I think we've seen that in more I guess, more prominent churches. That idea of it just kind of going off as its own thing. So yeah, I think what did it for me was COVID during that time. I was just like, oh man, like ministry is it's for the people. It's not for the church building or organization or to make this thing become bigger than what it is. Like, if anything, it's to care for the people in front of you. And I had lost sight of that from the very beginning, to be honest. Yeah, from the very beginning.
It is one of those sort of things that, I mean, it is difficult because if you've got a bigger church, it's more, you have to be more institutional.
Can you move the mic, Graeme?
You have to be more organised. So, in New Zealand, I mean, we do have big churches, but nothing like South Africa. Most churches in New Zealand, besides churches, 100 to 150, I would say.
Yeah, I would say, I won't name names, but I say the largest location of a local church that is campus, but just one local expression. I think the largest is like maybe 1,000, maybe, not even probably. So like that's the absolute max. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't know what. There's a couple of big churches in Auckland. I think they might gather more than that on its own.
Maybe. Yeah, true. Oh, true. Yeah, I forgot about that one. Yeah, never mind.
Yeah. So that institution, as you've been and run a rather large church, it tends to take over. So it's hard. It's actually hard to be people orientated, isn't it?
Yeah.
So how does that change your ministry? And I guess when you're thinking, both you and Charlie, as Linda is my wife's an ordained minister as well, you talk a lot, and so you're framing your philosophy of ministry as you're reflecting.
So I think when I was in quite a large church and it became quite institutionalized, it was about how do we equip everyone else to be more people orientated as well. One of the things that I noticed in that church, which if I could ever go back and change it, would be a couple of years prior to me, the senior minister, who's currently in a different country to South Africa as well. Actually, 3 of the senior ministers of that church immigrated.
Really?
What kind of conversations are you having?
What's going on there? You know, I guess
Nobody
the denomination
else to New Zealand, so it's okay.
the denomination will be asking that question too. We put people in that church and they go out, they leave the country.
But so what happened was that church did a real shift from being volunteer focused to being staff orientated. They followed like the Bill Hybels model.
Yeah.
And in hindsight, in my leadership, I had to try and undo some of that.
Yeah.
So because it became too, what would the word be? Corporate?
Yeah, corporate organizational.
It became too corporate organizational, and then it couldn't sustain itself.
Yeah.
And so suddenly we had too many staff. So during the middle of COVID, obviously because of finances, because of different reasons, we actually had to retrench staff. I don't know if as a pastor to retrench staff it just feels like it goes against everything in you.
It does. It's not.
It's so that was the worst thing I had to do. But I think in that institution, it's about how do we then equip other people. So I can minister to this group, but I can't minister to everybody. But how can we as this group then try and minister to everyone? But I also try to be very... I'm from a place called Springs in South Africa, which everyone teases because it's like the real bottom of the barrel kind of thing.
Really?
Yeah.
Nice.
Springs doesn't sound like a bottom of the barrel, since the place you want to be.
I live close to the bottom of the barrel in Canada, so I can relate a little bit.
So everyone would just tease me about being from Springs. So I've always been quite just down to earth. I like being teased. I enjoy being with people that don't have, So I do think the congregation have always felt like I'm accessible.
Right.
So sometimes I'd put off some of the administrative stuff just to have a conversation.
Yeah.
Because I enjoy people. Yeah. But churches, I think we sometimes do lose sight of that.
You've reminded me of a story. I think Jonathan told me this because I haven't read it. I think it did come from him. But it was Rowan Williams. He was off to a meeting one time. And so he was due at this meeting. But as he was walking to the meeting through London streets of London, he found somebody on the sidewalk in need. So he sat down and talked to them and was late for the meeting. I just think that's profoundly...
That's beautiful.
Yeah, it is. It is profound because often we can lose that side in the business of church.
The worst, I remember I mentioned this at a staff meeting at the church last week, but John Mark Comer's favorite thing to say is like, a hurried life is, this is a paraphrase, a hurried life is antithetical to a spiritual life. So it's almost like if you rush, if you have too much on the go or too much that's happening, you actually can't be attentive to God. I think the same is true when it comes to ministry. And it's like when you have too much ministry going on, you actually can't see the ministry in front of you. And you can't actually, ironically, you can't do the things that Jesus actually called you to do, because you can't even see the person who's your neighbor in front of you, like that Samaritan, the Samaritan who was, the Good Samaritan story, right? Like everyone else who was religious was obviously very busy, and also didn't like that person clearly, and just kept moving past them because they had something more important to do. And then it's like, well, this guy Rowan.
Yeah, no, it's quite a striking story. Well, I do remember when I was pastoring, it was the sense of a community morning, and like you have a lot to do. But I remember thinking, actually, it's really important just to hang loose and to be, so people can connect to you.
Yeah.
So there's no, it's quite, I mean, for me, I'm wired a little bit that way, but I also prioritized it too. I thought, actually, it's not a waste of time. It's important. Just pivoting a little bit.
All right.
You came here and you're doing an MBA. You're nearly finished this MBA. So that's intriguing. Why do an MBA?
Yeah, you talked about being a pastor. You talked about it. How do the two relate? What's going on?
Yeah.
So interesting. When I decided to further my studies, I thought of 3 different options. One was to do a PhD in theology.
Right.
Nobody would accept me yet. So anyway, I'll get there. And then I thought of going into teaching. And then the MBA popped up. And I thought about it for a long time, and I realized sometimes, this was my experience, I can't speak for other people, but my experience was that the church trained me in theology and the church trained me in pastoral work, but they never trained me in how to run an organization, but then held me accountable for things like budgets and staffing and HR. And so kind of figured if I could have the experience or some of the knowledge of how to run an organization well, that would help pastoring. It just felt as though, in actual fact, pastors have so much responsibility for an organization.
Oh,
yeah.
But I didn't have any of the training around how to run an organization well. And so I made some decisions that in hindsight, now that I understand a little bit more about the, running of an organization and leadership from that perspective, I go like, oh, wait, maybe I shouldn't have done it like that. Maybe there was a different way. I've been quite surprised by the MBA that they've pushed like ethical business so much. Like, how do you be an ethical leader? How do you run things ethically? How do you plan things? How do you look at your environment and just say like, oh, this is where we should be going. This is where the gaps are. And I was never taught that in a church. So in a church, it felt like, here's this organization that we want you to run, and you must run it well.
Yeah.
We're not going to tell you how. We're not going to give you the tools.
Yeah. Interesting. So what would be, I know the way the MBA is set up, that you have different guest lecturers and stuff come in, so you've had a wide variety of input. But what have been like a few things that have been like, oh, wow, like that's really big. Like, I'm really glad I learned that, or this has been really helpful for me, even processing like your pastoral ministry over the last couple decades.
Sure, good question. I think one of them was that we were talking about cross-cultural leadership, and the lecturer said that sometimes we think that when we need to be fair, we need to treat people equally. He said, but there's actually a difference. He said some people, you need to treat them in such a way because, now he's talking staff. So some staff, we need to hold them a little bit more accountable. We need to push them a little bit further because they tend to be, lazier or not have the drive or not have the responsibility. He says, and other staff, you just know that they're stars. You know that they're always doing too much. You know that they're always pushing too hard. And those people, we need to kind of try and give them more freedom and say, like, why don't you relax a little bit more? He says, but then the staff that I don't want to say micromanaging because that's a terrible phrase, but the staff that you're holding a little bit more accountable feel like you're unfair because why are you being that nice to those staff? And it was this discussion around, actually, It's about how do we move people so that they're the best version of themselves, and saying to them, if you want me to treat you like that, this is the behavior I expect. And so if we can work on your behavior so that you become like that, that's how I will treat you. I'm not being unfair to you. I'm actually just being fair to both of you. You need more supervision. That person needs less supervision. So how do we move you from someone who needs more supervision to someone who needs less supervision?
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, as a pastor, I always felt like I needed to treat everyone exactly the same. But you just knew that some staff, I had one staff that I was very, very fond of, and I'm still friends with that person. They would get away with doing as little as possible.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. They were just, he was the most laid back person that never did anything. I love him to bits. So I would have to push him a little bit in order to get him to do something.
Oh, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Was it Graeme?
No.
I was kidding.
Yeah, I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's difficult. Particularly, I mean, those are interesting relationships too. You're friendly with, it makes it difficult as well.
It does, yeah.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, yeah. So you can't, equality doesn't mean treating everybody the same, but
Yeah.
having the same expectations for everybody is where the equality sits.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm not expecting any more of you than somebody else. It's just, for some reason, you love to have an hour and a half long lunch break instead of an hour or 30 minutes, and then that's obviously showing on things not being done. Yeah, for sure. Interesting. Okay, anything else?
Another one was like looking at your market. So particularly around marketing or strategic thinking, the MBA showed me that it's about looking at what's happening in the environment with technology, with social, all of these different things, what's happening externally, what's happening internally, and then where do we like aim so that we have like a competitive advantage.
Yeah.
Or sustained competitive advantage. And I've often thought, like, how does that work with the church? And I was like, wow, maybe it's about saying, like, what is this church's call? Where should we be? How do we get there? And then part of that was that in industry, it's about looking at your wider industry. So it's about looking at your whole network, your whole value system, your value network system. And churches, I think sometimes we become so isolated, we forget that actually we're just one small part of a much bigger whole. So it's like, how do we, if I had to go back, I would try and do a lot more partnerships.
Yeah.
And try and figure out how do we support each other so that the churches in the community can actually make a bigger difference based on where they should be, but we're part of a network.
Yeah.
And I was like, why did industry have to show me that?
Because they're seeing things differently sometimes. I know that one of the big things in the early 90s and late 90s, and even to the 2000s as a result, was when Hillsong was starting to become a global presence as a church. Part of their vision was to be a global church always. And then after they started becoming that, I think a lot of other larger churches had shifted their mindset to being also global. And what I don't think they would have, what that kind of communicated to me, though, while I was going through my ministry formation was, oh, so you can do it all yourself? Like, you should just be you everywhere in the world? Like, what about everyone else who's already there that you're not? And what does that mean for the mission? Like, is there only one church that can, do you want this one church to be universal? Is that why you're going everywhere? Or, like, what does partnership look like within that? Like, how can you help other churches, be who God's called them to be, What were you going to say, Graeme?
I was just sort of thinking that I've just read it's actually Emma Brewer's analysis. She was commissioned to do research on finding some matrix to measure churches. So I read it on Friday and then just made a review on it in the weekend. So it's a lot of good talking points in there. But one of the things is, like, every church is different the way that you measure it. But what you were referring to is that there's kind of these ecosystems that exist, sort of environments. And when you're in that environment, all you see is that environment. And that has its own value system. It doesn't mean it's that value system is right. So when you're talking about the Hillsong thing, people got on there. That was generated by a lot of power, I think, visual power. So most churches in New Zealand have been affected by that. Just have a look at the front of the church. So 4 singers, a band. That's all. Where did they get that from? They've probably picked it up off the Hillsong tracks, the music and everything. So that all creates its own kind of ethos, its own sort of environment. And I think we get caught in those. We get caught in those systems, and then they dictate actually what the church is. And I think that's so it's difficult to think out of that.
Yeah, but then sorry.
So I'm thinking your MBA sort of has made you think a little bit outside of the box and thinking, well, what are those ecosystems? And like, is that the ecosystem? What's another ecosystem? Do they exist? And I mean, where do I sit in relation to that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as we wrap things up, what is... we usually do rapid fire questions at the end. This has turned into a really wonderful interview, I think. I've learned a lot about you, which is great. But one thing I'm really curious about as we kind of finish off is you moved from South Africa to New Zealand. You've been here basically a year now. What have you observed about New Zealand
question,
culture?
Joe. Yeah.
Like, and also, what have you noticed about your own culture that because of contrast?
So what I have learned is that, and sorry to any South Africans, a lot of the New Zealanders think that South Africans are very rude. I didn't know that.
The phrases like "you must do that."
Yeah.
You must do what?
And things like South Africans, we won't say please at the beginning of our sentence, but like sometimes just our phrasing, we're implying please, and all the South Africans know that we're implying please, but like...
Can you give me an example? Like, I'm going to go, I don't know, give me a scenario.
I would really like it if we had a meeting once a week. So
I'd really like it is like, please, can we
that's
meet once a
saying,
week?
oh, this is my idea. Can we discuss it? Please, can we do this? But like, so I think the New Zealanders, from my experience, see that, oh, you haven't used please, you're telling me what to do.
Yeah. So the tone of that would, if you said that, I'd go, and I'd be thinking, gosh, that's a bit strong, isn't it? So it's a nuance.
And in South Africa, that's me saying like, hey guys, I think this might be a good idea. Please, can we have a discussion?
And if you said it like that, you think, yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, but it's just the way we speak. So So South Africans, I think, especially our Afrikaans, my mother's Afrikaans, I can say this, but especially our Afrikaans South Africans are very strong. Like, we come across as very abrupt, very strong. So yeah, I didn't know that about South Africa.
Did you? I had during my first child, during the ultrasound period, I think it was the 20-week mark when you got to see all the like limbs and everything. It was like quite a full exam. We had a Afrikaans lady, and I didn't know the culture at all, and I was asking questions continually, and she had to put down the ultrasound device, and she just stared at me like this and was like, "I will set the tone for this. You don't need to ask any questions now. I will let you know everything." And I was like, okay, you're in charge. I was like, oh boy. I was just a very curious, inquisitive future father. And I was like, oh right.
Okay.
Oh, she just laid down the law, and I was like, all right, let's go for it. But I don't think she was being mean. I think it was like I was inhibiting her ability to do her job. And good for her. I was like, you know what? I'd rather you speak plainly to me personally than just be annoyed at me. So I actually respected it a little bit. But it was like I hadn't, living in Kiwi land, I hadn't experienced that level of like directness since I lived in Canada. Because we can also be quite direct in Canada as well. So I forgot what it was like to receive that.
Kiwis are not always direct.
No, incredibly indirect.
I think it's the English part of us.
Yeah. All right, so you've learned that about anything else? Any other observations?
Other observations is South Africans, I think we're very friendly.
Yeah.
So like we'll be, I'll have a conversation with absolutely anybody who wants to have a conversation. So I've had random conversations with people on the beach and,
Are people thrown back by that?
Yeah, a little bit until they hear my accent and then they're like, this makes sense. Okay, we'll carry on chatting. The other thing I've learned is that New Zealand is very health and safety conscious.
Yeah.
In a way that South Africa was never health and safety
I wouldn't say that South Africa's conscious of health and safety.
No, not at all.
At least from like some of the things I see on YouTube. Yeah.
It's the opposite. But I think it's attached to a value of life.
Yeah.
So when something happens in New Zealand where somebody is killed, like a car accident, it makes news, and it's
everywhere.
this big thing, and there's what can we do to prevent it in the future.
Roads closed, so highways shut down.
Yeah, in South Africa it wasn't like that at all. It didn't even make the news, you know. So I think it's attached to this deep value of life that I see in New Zealand that we didn't necessarily have in South Africa, and that transcends to a whole bunch of things.
Yeah.
And then just language issues. So like in South Africa, we'll say robot when we mean traffic light, or circle when we mean roundabout.
Yeah, little subtle things.
Very confusing things. And then some of the Kiwi things is like your togs. I was like, why are people taking rugby boots to the beach?
Oh.
Because togs in South Africa is a rugby boot.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and here it's a swimming costume.
Yeah, that's right.
It borders.
That's a big difference.
Yeah. Anyway, there's a really funny ad that aired, I think, in the early 2000s from here. That's called Undies Togs. And so the guy's basically walking away from the beach, and it's like, at what point does this turn into undies? And before it was togs. And it's like there's a line, and when do you cross it? It's really funny. Like, that's also part of the humor here as well. It's like, undies, oh, togs, undies. Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah.
I'm grateful for the humor here.
Yeah, it is
It is similar. Like, I can laugh at the same things.
Is there
really
similarities
good.
to South African humour?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's nice.
I think the same way. I love Kiwi humor. It's really funny. So mostly because like Canadians are funny too, but we don't have funny advertisements. Our ads are like propaganda-esque, especially like government ads are like, this is how we create an ideal society. Look at how amazing we are. Or in New Zealand, it's like, it's intense. Either like the ads are like going to tell you like do this crazy Auckland transporter like, you know, ad where someone's died and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to drive a car again, which is like funny in a weird sense. I'm like, how is this on TV? To like other ads where it's like, is this even an ad? I'm like, what did you even communicate about the product in this ad?
Is it like the one the TV, the latest one of advertising cell phones? Is it the one cell phone?
Oh yeah, where the guy goes to Scotland to see his.
Yeah, he's trying to figure out, and he figures out his parents is not really his parents, and he goes looking for his
biological parents.
Biological parents.
And you're
It's
like,
just a bit quirky.
I'm like, so what's this? Is a phone company? I'm like, we keep the world connected. I'm like, this sounds more like an Air New Zealand ad. He went on a plane, didn't he, to get to Scotland? I'm like, this is weird. Anyway, it's just like bizarre. But yeah, the humor here is really funny. Yeah. All right. Anything else or before we kind of end?
Oh.
You can say no.
No, I think I'm still trying to get my head around it.
Yeah, it's a lot. Yeah, it took me like the first year being here was like I hadn't processed like what that loss would be like of living away from home. My wife had, like when we first decided to move back to New Zealand for her, like she was obviously like upset before we even left Canada. And I'm like, it's going to be fine. We're going to get there. It's going to be all good. And then all of a sudden, like we move and she's fine. She's like back into the swing of things. Obviously, you know, there's an adjustment for sure. But like emotionally, it seemed like she was fine. And then, but me, I was like, why am I feeling this way? What's going on inside of me? What's this uprooted? Like, is this what it feels like to be uprooted? Like, this is very unnatural, like what I'm experiencing. And then it probably took about 2-3 years to like, for that to kind of go away. And I think in 2019 I visited and I really missed I moved here in 2018. 2019 visited, really missed Canada, and it was nice to see everyone again. But then when I went back in 2023, Canada just felt way less like home. Like really? Way less like home. Like I didn't feel like I belonged there anymore. Like I had changed quite a bit about even the conversations I'm having with people, even who I am, to where like Canada felt like a little bit of a foreign country, and I was like, that was weird. Yeah. So yeah, it's a weird journey being an immigrant. It's a weird journey. Not to end on that note, but thanks for being here with us.
Yeah,
this has been really enjoyable.
Yeah.
If we had you on again, I really want to talk about crazy ministry stories in South Africa, because I know you've got a few. Like they're insane. I think that'd be a great next conversation to have.
Yes, that would be good.
That'd be good. But thanks for taking the time, Louise.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.